April the 13th, 1945. 11 a.m. Washington, D.C. Harry Truman walked into a room he had never entered before. The Joint Chiefs of Staff sat waiting. He had been vice president for exactly 82 days and president for less than 24 hours. General George Marshall began discussing troop dispositions in the Pacific. He referenced plans Truman had never seen. Admiral Ernest King mentioned naval operations Truman didn't know existed. General Henry Arnold spoke about strategic bombing campaigns Truman had never been briefed on. Truman sat silent. He was supposed to lead these men, command the largest military force ever assembled, win a war being fought on 2 continents. But he knew almost nothing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not in America. Not to a vice president. Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901 after William McKinley's assassination. McKinley had kept him involved. Calvin Coolidge took office in 1923 when Warren Harding died. Coolidge had attended cabinet meetings. Harding started that practice in 1921. Franklin Roosevelt did the opposite. He systematically excluded Truman from strategy meetings, from cabinet sessions, from briefings that shaped the future of civilization. For 82 days, Truman presided over the Senate, nothing more. The question isn't whether Roosevelt kept secrets. Every president does. The question is, why did he keep them from the man who would inherit the most dangerous moment in human history? January the 20th, 1945, Roosevelt's 4th inauguration. The ceremony was brief. Roosevelt was too sick to stand for long. Truman took the oath as vice president on a cold winter morning. The crowds noticed Roosevelt's condition. His face was gaunt. His hand shook when he raised it. Truman's job was simple: preside over the Senate, stay out of the way. Roosevelt never explained why. By early 1945, Roosevelt's health had collapsed. He had lost weight dramatically. His memory was failing. At the Yalta Conference in February, Churchill and Stalin both noticed. Roosevelt struggled to focus during meetings that would determine the shape of the post-war world. Truman wasn't there. He wasn't briefed on what happened at Yalta either. Roosevelt returned in February. He never called Truman to discuss what had been decided with Stalin and Churchill. What promises had been made? What territories had been bargained for? What future had been designed? Truman learned about Yalta the same way most Americans did, from newspapers. During those 82 days as vice president, Truman had 1 or 2 substantial private meetings with Roosevelt. On March 19th, they spoke for about an hour. Administrative matters, mostly. Appointments, patronage. The kind of politics that filled time but changed nothing. No discussion of war strategy. No talk of diplomacy. No mention of the atomic bomb being built in secret across 3 states. Roosevelt knew he was dying. Everyone around him knew. His doctors knew. His advisors knew. The leaders who met him at Yalta knew. But he never prepared Truman. April 12th, 1945. Hours after taking the oath as president, Secretary of War Henry Stimson pulled Truman aside. He mentioned briefly a highly secret explosive project. He didn't explain what it was, just that it existed. Truman didn't press for details, not yet. There were too many other crises demanding immediate attention. 13 days later, on April 25th, Stimson returned, this time with a full briefing. The Manhattan Project had been running for 3 years. $2 billion spent, 130,000 workers employed, secret cities built in Tennessee and Washington state, massive facilities constructed in the desert, a weapon nearly complete. Testing is scheduled soon. Truman had been president for 13 days, vice president for 82 before that, and he was only now learning that America had been building a bomb capable of destroying entire cities. No vice president in American history had been kept this ignorant. But the atomic bomb wasn't the only secret. Over the following weeks, Truman discovered the full scope of what Roosevelt had hidden. Soviet espionage warnings that had been ignored or suppressed, secret agreements with Stalin about Far East territories, including parts of China and Japan, ultra and magic code-breaking operations that had been reading German and Japanese communications for years. Post-war economic plans already in motion. The Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, all designed without Truman's knowledge, all ready to reshape global finance. Roosevelt had built an entire hidden architecture of power, and he never told the man who would inherit it. Why? Some said Roosevelt didn't trust Truman, that he saw him as a political necessity, not a partner. Truman had been chosen to balance the ticket in 1944, to appeal to border states, to satisfy party bosses who didn't want Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's previous vice president, anywhere near power. Roosevelt never wanted Truman. He accepted him. But distrust doesn't fully explain it. Others argued Roosevelt's ego wouldn't allow a successor, that he believed he was irreplaceable, that preparing Truman meant admitting mortality. Roosevelt had led America through the Depression and the greatest war in history. Perhaps he convinced himself he would see it through to the end. But Roosevelt was a realist. He knew his body was failing. The simplest explanation is the hardest to accept. Roosevelt didn't think it mattered. He believed the systems he built, the advisors he trusted, and the momentum of American power would carry forward regardless of who sat in the Oval Office. That the presidency was bigger than any single man, even the man who held it. He was wrong. Truman fired Roosevelt's cabinet. Not immediately, but over 18 months he replaced nearly every key figure. Edward Stettinius at the State Department was replaced by James Burns in July 1945. Henry Wallace at Commerce was fired in September 1946. Truman didn't trust the people Roosevelt trusted. How could he? They had kept him in the dark. The consequences reached further than anyone predicted. On August 6, 1945, Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb against Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. Truman made those decisions with less than 4 months of preparation. 4 months to understand a weapon that had taken 3 years to build. 4 months to grasp the strategic implications of a technology that would define the next 70 years. Roosevelt never told him it existed. What if Truman had been briefed earlier? What if he had been part of the conversations about whether to use it, whether to demonstrate it first, whether to share the technology with the Soviets to prevent an arms race? We'll never know what Roosevelt intended, because he never explained his reasoning, never justified his secrecy, never prepared the man who would have to live with the consequences. The Cold War began before the Second World War ended. Tensions with Stalin escalated immediately after Germany's surrender. Truman found himself negotiating with a Soviet leader who had already made secret deals with Roosevelt, deals Truman didn't know about, promises he couldn't verify, expectations he couldn't meet. Roosevelt's hidden agreements became Truman's inherited disasters. In 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act. It created the National Security Council, and it did something no previous law had done. It mandated that the vice president be included in meetings, given intelligence updates, briefed on nuclear protocols, read into classified programs. The law didn't mention Roosevelt. It didn't need to. Everyone knew why it existed, to make sure no vice president would ever again walk into a room of generals and admirals with no idea what war they were fighting, no understanding of what weapons they possessed, no knowledge of what promises their predecessor had made. The law was Truman's answer to Roosevelt's silence. History remembers Franklin Roosevelt as one of America's greatest presidents, the man who saved democracy twice, once from economic collapse, once from fascism. But greatness doesn't excuse what he did to Truman. Roosevelt's secrecy wasn't strategy. It was arrogance. The belief that he alone understood what America needed, that his judgment was sufficient, that his successor didn't need to know because his successor would never match him. Truman proved him wrong. But Truman shouldn't have had to prove anything. He should have been prepared, informed, trusted with the responsibilities he would inherit. Roosevelt's failure wasn't keeping secrets from enemies. Every leader does that. His failure was keeping secrets from the man who would have to carry his legacy forward. 82 days. That's how long Truman served as vice president. In that time, Roosevelt met with Churchill, with Stalin, with military commanders planning the final assaults on Berlin and Tokyo, with scientists building a weapon that would end one war and define the next. But he didn't meet with Truman, not about anything that mattered. April 12th, 1945, the day Roosevelt died. Truman walked into the White House as president. He inherited a war a collapsing alliance, a secret weapon, a hidden network of agreements and promises. And he had to figure it all out, alone, because the man who knew everything had told him nothing. That wasn't leadership. That was betrayal. And it almost broke the country Roosevelt spent 12 years trying to save.